Britain is looking increasingly divided socially, racially and politically. The national mood is introspective following a series of recent terrorist attacks. Concern over inequality highlighted by the deadly fire in a high-rise block of London flats, and unease and uncertainty because of Brexit. Jo Cox has had a personal and painful encounter with extremism. His wife, the politician Jo Cox, was murdered a year ago as she campaigned against Brexit. Since then, he has created a nationwide movement for unity, inspired by his wife's words that we have more in common than that which divides us. Well, Brendan joins me from London. Many thanks for being with us, Brendan.
Thank you.
Well, let's look at some of the issues I've just raised there, and particularly those terrorist attacks just now in London, this time the Muslim community that was targeted. Now, I grew up in London, and when I grew up there, at least it seemed a tolerant city. Is that no longer the case?
No, it's increasingly tolerant. London and indeed the country as a whole, if you look at all of the trends, it is towards tolerance. People are more tolerant of difference, whether that is religious or racial or your sexuality or your gender. I think what has happened in the last period is not actually that the number of people that hold extreme views has increased. In fact, if anything, I think it's decreased. But what has happened is because of the legitimisation of the narrative, the people like Trump, Le Pen, Wilders, Farage and others, what they do is they legitimise a narrative of hate speech. And of course, they're not directly responsible for these atrocities when they happen, the attacks on Muslims today, the hate crimes that you've seen post the referendum. But what they are responsible for is a climate in which people who have those particularly extreme views are more likely to act upon them about things.
So what you're saying is that these far-right politicians have enabled, in some respects, this hatred. But where is this hatred actually coming from, then?
I think that hatred has always been there. You know, you've always had a tiny minority of people in countries who are driven by hatred, who, for reasons of their own insecurities and lack of prospects and lack of love or brainwashing in some cases, have ended up pinning themselves to an extreme ideology to try to find meaning. That's true with the Islamist-inspired extremism. It's true with the far-right extremism. And the thing that I find really interesting is that, you know, the politics of hatred that drives these groups is essentially the same. You know, if you look about what they have in common, they both believe that that people should live in pure states, whether that's religiously pure or ethnically pure. They both believe that it's legitimate to attack civilians to try and achieve that, and they both believe that people of different shouldn't live together and shouldn't be able to create diverse, tolerant countries.
OK, well, you have taken on, obviously, the mantle of campaigner in this, kind of trying to bring people together, to inspire togetherness. But this goes beyond a campaigner, beyond an individual. Are you satisfied with the political response you've been seeing in response to this spate of attacks?
I think that the government does take this seriously. I think it takes both Islamist-inspired terrorism and far-right-inspired terrorism seriously. And how do we actually, at a much more community level, how do we drive out the hatred? We spend a lot of our time in response to an attack like 7/7 or 9/11 or the Bataclan or any of those other examples, looking to try and understand where is that hatred coming from. And often it is hate preachers, and that's exactly the same case in this example. There are people, often quite mainstream, in quite mainstream outlets, media outlets, who are promoting a narrative which is deeply Islamophobic, that is frankly bordering on incitement to violence against Muslims. And I think we have to, in the same way that we crack down on hate speech against coming from Islamists, we also have to crack down on hate speech directed at the entire Muslim community.
Well, let's also look at the issue of wealth disparity and that terrible fire that happened in West London, because many of those inhabitants of those high-rise towers were newcomers to London, you know, among them the disenfranchised of the city, living in one of the wealthiest parts of London. So if we're going to look at questions of social integration, the problems there are going to be exacerbated, are they not, by wealth inequality?
What I do think we do need to worry about is the social stratification that has happened, and I think that what the tower block fire is doing is just bringing rise and giving story to a much wider story, which I think is not just in the capital, but is particularly acute in the capital. And I think there is understandable anger that we are increasingly living in a divided society, and that's where government actively needs to be seeking to play a role. And lots of the forces, lots of the economic forces are currently pulling our communities apart from each other. I think there's, as I said, both a sort of governmental response, but there's also then a community response.
And also need to take on also how to deal with Brexit. You mentioned those European politicians that were leading for a more kind of fractious European politics. They've obviously not been elected, and Europe is coming together, and it seems Britain is being left increasingly on the outside. Do you get a sense of that?
See, I think what happened over the last period, the last couple of years, was there was a huge amount of complacency, and it took the elections in Austria, took the elections in France, and it took the election of Donald Trump in the US to shake our collective consciousness about the seriousness of the threat to our values. I think it's a big mistake if, whether it's Europe as an entity or any individual country, thinks that we have somehow, weathered that storm. I think the storm is going to continue. I think it's going to grow. I think it's going to get more intense. And so therefore we need to be thinking about what we can do to build our communities, to build that narrative about closer communities, and also physically bring our communities together in a way that I think we've failed to do in lots of different countries over the last few years.
Well, I'd like to finish now just maybe on a more personal note, because obviously you're driving for more togetherness. When it comes to your own personal story, where does forgiveness fit into that?
I think for me, forgiveness is something that I would think about if there was remorse. And as long as there is no remorse, I have no interest in forgiveness. But it's not, I've said this a few times, I fixate on Jo and how she lived her life, the values she fought for, the beliefs that she espoused, the causes that she advanced, and the way that she lived her life, all with energy, enthusiasm. I'm not going to let my memories of Jo be clouded by the actions of a horrific and evil extremist. I'm going to keep focusing on how she lived, not how she died.
Brendan, many thanks for having been with us on The Global Conversation.
Thank you.